Life. Conversations about Ukraine, Russia, and everything in between. Hello, my name is Emily Kessler, and I'm very excited to be sharing this podcast with you. In this podcast, I will be sharing a little bit about the history of Russia and Ukraine to help understand the current conflict. In the process of creating this podcast, I interviewed multiple people who have been personally affected either by the war or by the general situation in Russia and Ukraine. For example, I've interviewed people who are Ukrainian, Russian, and or grew up under the Soviet Union and personally experienced what that was like. Here in the United States, we see many headlines, but sometimes it can be difficult for people to really connect. And my goal here is to share experiences of people who this is very personal to and what is happening, as well as to understand the history, because I believe it's very important to know that to understand the conflict and the war that is happening today. I remember on February 21st, which was ironically my birthday, Putin gave a speech, and he basically announced that Russia would be invading Ukraine. And the invasion began on February 24th, 2022. This was a horrible day for I know myself, but many people I know who are Ukrainian and were directly affected and worried about their families and just the safety of their country. To give a little backstory so you know who I am half Lithuanian. My mom is Lithuanian, and she grew up under the Soviet Union for all of her childhood, really. And my grandma also, and my grandparents grew up under the Soviet Union, as Lithuania was part of the Soviet Union at the time, which I'll explain a little bit more of the history of in just a bit. But it was very shocking for me and my family there because it's very close to home, and Lithuania, having experience being under the Soviet Union, it was just in great fear of what would happen and great fear for Ukraine. And there has been lots of solidarity with Lithuanians and Ukrainians, and just standing and fighting for Ukraine. I remember I went to a protest in Chicago for Ukraine, and I just felt like I wanted to do everything I could to just help Ukraine and stop the invasion. But my experience and feelings were nothing compared to those who were personally affected and those who are in Ukraine and who are suffering. So my goal here is to bring light to them and highlight their experiences and share with people who might not necessarily, unfortunately, might not focus on the news or not be following the conflict. And I just want to explain to everyone why it is so important to help Ukraine and what can be done and what is needed to learn in order to do that. First, I want to talk a little bit about the history. So the Soviet Union, or the USSR, was a dictatorship and a socialist republic. It occupied many countries, with a few being what is now current Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Latvia, Lithuania, what is now Moldova, Russia, and also including Ukraine. This is important to understand in order to understand Putin and Russia's purpose in this war, as Russia obviously is wanting to take Ukraine back under Russian rule. It will also be relevant to understand that there is also an Eastern Bloc, which were countries that were indirectly controlled by the USSR, one of which being Romania. So there were other places that were affected by the Soviet Union and this rule, even though they weren't technically a part of the Soviet Union. So the USSR collapsed, and on December 25th, 1991, the republics the states that were part of the Soviet Union became independent, and Ukraine was one of them. Now, knowing this, it can also be used to understand why Putin started this war in the first place. So Putin's argument is that the Eastern Slavs, being Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, should be united as they have been in the past. They were historically intertwined and had close relationships. However, what Putin and Russian officials failed to realize is that Ukraine became, as Jeffrey Mankoff says in his article published in CSIS, Ukrainified, meaning that Ukraine was independent and did have its own culture and language and was able to bring it back and be very different from Russia. Well, not very different, I should say, but having their own individual identity from Russia and don't think of themselves as a part of Russia. Ukraine is called Little Ukraine by some Russians and by Russian officials. And Putin said that Ukraine is not even a country. So this really just shows where Putin is coming from and why he started this invasion in the first place. However, it does not justify it, as many officials have seen, and it completely does not justify this war, which needs to end. Knowing this, looking a little closer to the future, Putin annexed Crimea, which is a part of Ukraine that has a high Russian population, and he did this by conducting a referendum. However, according to EU and US officials, they were likely fraudulent and not fully transparent as to what it said it was. However, Putin did this anyway and annexed Crimea in 2014, and also in 2014 invaded the Donbass region, which really began the Russo-Ukraine war. Tensions have continued in those last years, but now, as we saw on February 21st, when Putin gave his speech, in February 24th of 2022, the actual invasion of Ukraine began. It has been happening, and still, as of today, which is November 15th, 2022, it is still occurring. However, there have been many updates and shifts in the war, which we will explore. Russia, in this conflict, though went in with a full-on offensive, does not have the resources nor the soldiers to continue that large invasion, looking to try and take all of Ukraine. It's simply not possible, as Putin has seen. And lately, in the last months, a month or so, like in September, Ukraine actually started to gain back a lot of land and be on the offensive. Ukraine is getting support from financial and resource support from other countries, as well as NATO and the EU. However, there has been no direct intervention from any foreign power besides Russia and Ukraine. And as of now, it is the Ukrainian forces that are fighting and pushing back against Russia. Unfortunately, this is not all. There's more with civilians being attacked by Russia. There are many war crimes that are being committed against Ukrainians, and it's illegal for Russia to be committing these, and it is causing huge casualties, human suffering, and loss of life. Therefore, it is imperative that this war ends as soon as possible with the least amount of bloodshed. I hope that by sharing the experiences of people who have been affected, we'll be able to give those who might not keep up to date on the war or understand, really just be able to see a perspective that they might not have heard before. Many people are dying, and this is a very, very dire situation that is still continuing today. If you're interested in learning more about this conflict and hearing interviews and accounts of people who have personal stories to share, continue listening and stay tuned. I have learned so much during this process, and I really just want to share that with you so you can experience the same thing. I've got to hear stories from people who are close to me that I might not necessarily have heard in this way, or people that I maybe never would have even gotten the chance to speak with if it weren't for this project and this podcast. Next up, you can look forward to hearing from my friend Stephanie, who is Ukrainian, and she has a lot to tell in her story. I hope that you learned something today and that you come back to listen to people's stories regarding the war. Thank you for tuning in to Life, conversations about Ukraine, Russia, and everything in between. Slava Ukraini!